While I fought for my life delivering premature twins, my husband was at a hotel with his first love, ignoring every call from the hospital. 4 days later, he returned home expecting us there. The house was empty. A note on the counter read only 5 words. I finally chose myself Austin. My name is Bella, and before I tell you what those 5 words cost him, I need you to understand what he was doing while I was screaming his name in an operating room, begging a nurse to try his phone one more time. I was 31 weeks pregnant with twins when my water broke at 2 in the morning. I remember the exact sound the contractions made me make, a sound I didn't know a human body could produce. I remember gripping the hospital bed rail so hard my knuckles went white, and I remember asking, over and over, "Where is my husband? Has anyone reached my husband?" Nobody had. I had called Austin 11 times before they wheeled me into the operating room. 11 times his phone rang, and 11 times it went to voicemail. I left messages that got shorter and more frightened each time. By the 9th call, I wasn't even forming full sentences anymore. I was just saying his name into the phone like it was a prayer. The nurse who stayed by my head during the emergency cesarean, a woman named Dolores with kind eyes and gray hair pulled into a tight bun, held my hand and told me to breathe. She told me the babies were coming whether their father made it or not, and that I needed to focus on staying strong for them. I remember thinking, in the haze of fear and anesthesia, that I would give anything for Austin to walk through those doors. I remember believing, with the kind of desperate faith only a frightened person can hold, that something terrible must have happened to him. A car accident, a robbery, something that would explain the silence. I was wrong. Nothing had happened to him. He was simply somewhere he didn't want to be interrupted. Silas was born first, weighing barely 3 pounds, his cry thin and reedy like a kitten's mew. 2 minutes later came June, even smaller, so small the doctor's whole hand could wrap around her tiny foot. Both of them were rushed to the neonatal intensive care unit before I even got to hold them. I lay on that operating table, cut open, shaking uncontrollably from the anesthesia, and I could not stop crying, not from pain, but from the crushing loneliness of bringing 2 lives into the world without a single hand to hold that belonged to someone who loved me. My sister Charlotte arrived within the hour. She lived 2 states away, but she got in her car the moment I called her, sobbing from the recovery room. She stayed by my bedside that first night, and she was the one who kept trying Austin's phone for me because my hands were shaking too badly to hold mine. He didn't answer her calls either. For 4 days, I lay in that hospital bed, healing from major surgery, walking down sterile hallways to sit beside 2 incubators and press my fingers gently against glass because my babies were too fragile to be held properly yet. For 4 days, my husband did not call, did not text, did not appear. The hospital staff started looking at me with a particular kind of pity I recognized even through my exhaustion. The pity people give you when they've figured out the truth before you're ready to say it out loud. I told myself he must be dealing with something urgent for work. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Even as the silence stretched into its 3rd day, some stubborn, foolish part of me kept defending him in my own mind, because the alternative felt too ugly to consider. The truth, when it finally came out, was uglier than anything I could have imagined. Let me back up, because to understand how deeply this betrayal cut, you need to know what our marriage looked like from the outside, and what it had actually been on the inside for longer than I wanted to admit. Austin and I met 8 years ago at a mutual friend's barbecue. He was funny in that easy, confident way that makes a room lean toward him, and he made me laugh so hard on our first conversation that I spilled lemonade down my shirt. We dated for 2 years before he proposed on a hiking trail we'd walked a dozen times before. Nothing fancy, just him getting down on one knee with a ring he'd saved 3 months of overtime pay to afford. We had been married for 6 years by the time our twins were born. I remember thinking on our wedding day that I had found the kind of love people write songs about. For the first 4 years of our marriage, I believed that completely. We built a life together in a modest house with a garden I was slowly learning to keep alive, a life that felt, if not perfect, at least solid. Austin worked as a project manager at a construction firm. I taught third grade at an elementary school 15 minutes from our house. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable, and more than that, we were, I thought, happy. The shift happened so gradually, I almost didn't notice it happening. It started with him picking up his phone quickly whenever a certain name flashed on the screen, and turning the screen away from me out of what I told myself was simple habit. It continued with him working later and later, with excuses about deadlines that never seemed to have a beginning or an end. When I found out I was pregnant with twins, I was overjoyed, and I thought, foolishly, that the news would pull him back toward me, toward us, toward the family we were building. Instead, he grew more distant. He would disappear for hours on weekends, claiming he was meeting old friends from college. He started going to the gym at odd hours, sometimes leaving at 9 at night and not returning until well past midnight. When I asked questions, gently at first and then with growing desperation, he accused me of being paranoid, of letting pregnancy hormones make me insecure. He made me feel foolish for noticing what my instincts were screaming at me was true. I know now that the woman's name was Vesper Lang, and that she was not some new stranger who had recently entered his life. She was his first serious girlfriend, the one he had dated in high school and the first 2 years of college, before what he later called, with a shrug that made me want to scream, circumstances pulled them apart. She had reappeared in his life about a year before our twins were born, reconnecting with him first through an old college group chat, and then privately, and then, apparently in person. While I was doubling in size, swollen and exhausted and growing 2 entire human beings inside my body, my husband was rekindling a romance with the girl he'd loved before me. While I was attending every prenatal appointment, sometimes alone because he was busy, he was meeting Vesper for dinners he never told me about. And on the single most terrifying night of my life, the night our son and daughter fought their way into this world nearly 2 months early, my husband was checked into a hotel room 40 minutes from the hospital, phone deliberately switched to silent, so that nothing could interrupt his time with her. He would later claim, when he finally deigned to explain himself, that he needed space to think. He would say the pregnancy had scared him, that he wasn't sure he was ready to be a father, that being near Vesper reminded him of a simpler, freer version of his life. None of that explained the silenced phone. None of that explained 4 days of silence while his wife lay in a hospital bed and his premature children fought for their lives in incubators. A man who is confused calls his wife back eventually. A man who is guilty avoids her entirely because facing her means facing what he's done. On the 4th day, I was discharged from the hospital without my babies because they needed more time in the NICU than I did to recover from surgery. I remember the particular emptiness of walking out of those hospital doors with my arms wrapped around nothing, my body still healing, my heart in 2 separate incubators 3 floors up behind me. Charlotte drove me home, and the entire ride I kept thinking he'll be there. He has to be there. Whatever this is, it will make sense when I see his face. I later pieced together, through Charlotte and a neighbor who happened to see his car that morning, that Austin had actually returned to the house hours before I did, still expecting, in whatever version of reality he was living in, to find his pregnant wife there waiting for him. He had missed every call, ignored every voicemail, and had no idea the twins had already been born 4 days earlier. When he walked through that door and found the house silent, no wife, no signs of a baby anywhere, something in him finally seemed to understand the scale of what he had done. Rather than call me, rather than drive to the hospital and face what he had missed, he packed a bag, wrote 5 words on a piece of paper, and left again before I ever arrived. The house was empty when Charlotte and I pulled into the driveway. The mail had piled up on the small table by the door. The plants I usually kept watered were beginning to droop. And on the kitchen counter, propped against the fruit bowl, was a single folded piece of paper. I unfolded it with hands that had not stopped shaking since the moment my water broke 4 days earlier. 5 words, in his handwriting, the same handwriting that had once signed our wedding vows. I finally chose myself Austin. Not I'm sorry. Not I made a mistake. Not even the decency of an explanation. Just a declaration, cold and final, as though 4 years of marriage and 2 newborn children fighting for their lives could be dismissed as an obstacle to his own personal fulfillment. I sat down on the kitchen floor, still in the loose clothes I'd worn home from the hospital, and I did not cry the way I expected to. I felt, instead, a strange, hollow stillness, the kind that comes right before a storm truly breaks. Charlotte found me there 20 minutes later, and it was her voice, sharp with fury, that finally cracked the numbness open. She held me while I sobbed until I had nothing left, and then she made me a cup of tea I never drank, and she stayed on our couch that night, and every night after, for the next 3 weeks. I want to tell you that I found out everything about Austin and Vesper immediately, but the truth unraveled slowly, the way ugly truths often do, piece by piece, each one worse than the last. It started with a phone call from a woman named Rosalind, a former co-worker of Austin's who had heard through the grapevine what had happened and felt, in her words, that I deserved to know the full picture rather than fragments. Rosalind told me that Austin and Vesper had been seeing each other in secret for nearly 8 months, that co-workers at his firm had noticed him leaving early on certain days, always the same days Vesper apparently had off from her own job, that he had told at least one close friend, drunk at a bar one night, that he felt trapped by impending fatherhood and that being with Vesper felt like going back to who I used to be before all of this. Before all of this, as though our marriage, our home, our unborn children, were an inconvenience layered on top of the life he actually wanted. I later learned, through documents I had every legal right to access once I filed for divorce, that Austin had been withdrawing money from our joint savings account for months, small amounts at first, then larger ones, funneling cash toward hotel stays and dinners I had no knowledge of. The exact hotel where he stayed during the birth of our children was a boutique property 40 minutes outside the city, one he had booked under a fake reservation name, paid for with cash he'd withdrawn 3 days prior. 40 minutes. He had been 40 minutes away from the hospital where his children were being born nearly 2 months early, and he could not be bothered to drive back, could not be bothered to answer a single call, because answering would have meant walking away from her. There was one more detail Rosalind told me that night on the phone, one that took the breath out of my lungs entirely. She said that on the night I went into labor, Austin's phone had, in fact, buzzed against the hotel nightstand more than once. She knew this because a mutual acquaintance who had spoken to Vesper afterward told her that Vesper had been the one to reach over and turn the phone face down, sliding it into a drawer so the light wouldn't disturb them. Austin never picked it back up until the following morning. He knew, within hours, that something urgent was happening. He chose, deliberately, not to look. I sat with that detail for a long time after Rosalind hung up. It would have been easier in some ways to believe he simply never heard the phone ring, that ignorance rather than choice had kept him from me. But the truth was colder than that. He had heard it. He had let someone else silence it for him. And he had gone back to sleep beside her while I was being cut open in an operating room 40 minutes away. I share all of this not to relive my own pain for the sake of it, but because I think there is a particular kind of woman watching this who has felt what I felt in that moment on the kitchen floor, who has had the ground pulled out from under her by someone she trusted completely. I want her to know what I know now, which is that the story does not end on that kitchen floor. It only begins there. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life, harder even than the surgery, harder than the 4 days of silence. Silas and June remained in the NICU for another 5 weeks after I brought myself home to that empty house. I drove to the hospital every single day, sometimes twice a day, sitting beside their incubators for hours, reading to them in a voice I forced steady even when my chest felt like it was collapsing. Charlotte came with me as often as she could. My mother flew in from 3 states away and stayed for 6 weeks straight, sleeping on an air mattress in my home office, cooking meals I often couldn't bring myself to eat. Austin did not visit the NICU once during those 5 weeks. Not once. I want to say that again, because I still find it difficult to comprehend even now. His son and daughter lay in incubators, wires taped to their impossibly small bodies, fighting to grow strong enough to breathe on their own, and their father did not come to see them a single time. He sent one text message during that entire period, asking me to handle things while he figured some stuff out. I did not respond. There was nothing left in me to give him. Austin did try once to come back. It was 11 days after I found the note, and I remember the knock on the door because it was so tentative, so unlike the confident man I had married. He stood on our porch in the same jacket he'd worn the day he left, unshaven, holding a bouquet of grocery store flowers still wrapped in plastic, and he told me he had made a mistake. That Vesper had been a moment of weakness, that he wanted to come home and be a father to Silas and June. I asked him one question before I closed the door. I asked him what he had been doing at the exact moment our children were born. He hesitated, just long enough for me to see the answer forming behind his eyes before he even spoke it. Some half-formed lie about being stuck in traffic, about his phone dying. I had already seen the hotel records by then. I had already spoken to Rosalind. I let him finish his sentence, and then I told him, calmly, that I no longer believed a single word that came out of his mouth, and I shut the door. He came back 2 more times over the following weeks, each visit shorter than the last. Each one met with the same steady refusal. By the 4th attempt, I no longer felt the urge to shake or cry when I saw his car in the driveway. I simply felt tired, the way you feel tired of a song that has played too many times, worn thin by repetition until it no longer holds any power over you at all. I filed for divorce 3 weeks after finding that note on the counter. I did it not out of spite, though I certainly had reason for that, but out of a growing, clarifying certainty that I did not want to spend one more day of my life waiting for a man who had already made his choice, days before he ever wrote it down in 5 words on a piece of paper. The legal process, I won't pretend, was ugly at times. Austin's lawyer initially tried to argue for reduced financial responsibility, claiming his mental health during the pregnancy had impaired his judgment. I remember sitting in the office of my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ferreira who a friend had recommended to me personally, and laughing, actually laughing, at the audacity of it. A man who could plan a fake hotel reservation, withdraw cash in careful increments over months, and silence his phone with deliberate precision was not a man suffering from impaired judgment. He was a man executing a plan. My attorney built our case methodically. The financial records, showing the pattern of withdrawals, the hotel reservation, Rosalind's willingness to testify to what she'd witnessed at the firm. Text messages Austin had, foolishly, never deleted from a shared family cloud account he'd forgotten, still synced to our home computer, messages to Vesper that made it clear exactly how long this had been going on and exactly how little regard he held for the family he was abandoning. One message, dated the very afternoon our twins were born, stopped me cold when my attorney first showed it to me. Vesper had asked him, in writing, whether he was going to check his phone, since it kept lighting up on the nightstand. Austin's reply, time-stamped less than an hour after Silas and June took their first breaths, read only, let it ring. Tonight is about us. My attorney used that single message more effectively than almost anything else in the case because it proved, in his own words, that his silence had not been an accident of circumstance. It had been a decision, made in real time, while his children fought for their lives 3 floors above an operating table he never once considered walking toward. The court proceedings took the better part of a year. During that time, I focused everything I had on my children. Silas came home from the NICU first, 4 pounds and fierce even then, a fighter from his very first breath. June followed 12 days later, smaller still but every bit as determined. I remember carrying them both through our front door for the first time, one in each arm, and standing in that living room where Austin's absence still felt carved into the walls, and making a silent promise to both of them that I would build them a life so full of love they would never once feel the shape of what their father had failed to give them. I went back to teaching part-time when the twins were 4 months old, leaning heavily on my mother and Charlotte, who had, by then, decided to relocate closer to me permanently. My colleagues at school, women who had watched me grow enormous with pregnancy and then disappear into maternity, leave under circumstances they'd heard whispers about, rallied around me in a way that still moves me to think about. They organized meal trains. They took turns watching the twins during teacher conferences. One of them, a kindergarten teacher named Hannah, became one of my closest friends during that period, someone who reminded me, gently and consistently, that I was more than the wreckage of my marriage. As for Austin, his relationship with Vesper did not survive contact with reality, as these things so often don't. I learned, through the same small-world grapevine that had first alerted me to the affair, that Vesper had never actually planned to build a life with him. She had, according to people who knew her, viewed the relationship as something exciting and forbidden precisely because it existed outside the boundaries of a real commitment. The moment Austin was legally free, the moment the fantasy required him to actually show up as a partner rather than an escape from responsibility, she lost interest entirely. She ended things with him roughly 4 months after our divorce was finalized, and from what I understand, did so over a text message, which felt, when I heard about it, like a strange and bitter kind of poetic justice. Austin's life afterward did not improve. He lost his position at the construction firm roughly a year after the divorce, following what former colleagues described as a steady decline in his performance and reliability that management had apparently been documenting for some time. Whether that decline was tied to the collapse of his second attempt at happiness with Vesper, I couldn't say for certain, and honestly, by that point, I had stopped caring enough to speculate. He reached out to me periodically over the following 2 years, always around the twins' birthday, always with some version of an apology that felt more focused on his own guilt than on any genuine understanding of what he had done. I allowed him supervised visitation initially, believing, perhaps too generously, that children deserve the chance to know their father regardless of his failures as a husband. But Austin's commitment to even that arrangement proved as unreliable as everything else about him. He missed visits. He canceled at the last minute, sometimes without any explanation at all. Eventually, on the advice of my attorney, and more importantly, on the strength of my own resolve, I stopped extending opportunities to a man who had already shown, in the most devastating way possible, exactly how little he prioritized his children when it mattered most. There was a final encounter with Austin, about 18 months after the divorce was finalized, one I did not expect and never sought out. I ran into him at a grocery store on a Saturday afternoon, Silas balanced on my hip, and June gripping the edge of the cart with both fists, babbling about the cereal boxes. Austin froze in the aisle when he saw us, and for a moment neither of us said anything. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, with the particular hollowed-out look of a man whose plans had not worked out the way he imagined. He asked, quietly, if he could say hello to the twins. I let him, because I have never wanted to be the reason my children believe kindness is something to be withheld out of spite, even from someone who has earned very little of it. He crouched down to their level, and June, ever the braver of the two, offered him a high five without any recognition in her eyes, because she was not yet 2 years old the last time he had seen her in person, and a stranger's face means nothing to a child who was never given the chance to memorize it. I watched something break across Austin's expression in that moment, a grief I did not feel obligated to soften for him. He had built that distance himself, one silenced phone call, one missed visit, one broken promise at a time. I was not going to pretend otherwise for his comfort. Before I walked away, he asked me if I was happy. I told him the truth, which was that I was still building toward it, piece by piece, but that for the first time in years, I recognized the woman doing the building. He nodded, said nothing else, and let us go. I have not seen him since. There is one more piece of his story I think about often, one that arrived almost 2 years after the divorce. Quiet and unannounced, the way real closure often does. My mother, who had kept a distant but polite friendship with a woman from Austin's extended family over the years, mentioned to me one evening that Vesper had left the state entirely, moving somewhere out west for a fresh start after a string of what my mother diplomatically called complicated relationships. I did not feel triumph hearing that. I felt, instead, a kind of quiet release, the understanding that the person I had once imagined as some glamorous, irresistible force capable of dismantling my marriage in an instant was, in the end, simply a woman chasing a version of happiness she never quite managed to hold on to either. There was no magic in what she offered Austin. There was only the temporary thrill of something forbidden, and thrills, by their nature, do not last. Today, Silas and June are thriving. They are bright, curious, endlessly energetic 5-year-olds who fill our home with a kind of noise and laughter I once feared I would never hear again after that silent, empty house I walked into 4 days after giving birth. Silas has developed an obsession with dinosaurs, so thorough he can pronounce names I still stumble over. June has decided, with the total confidence only a 5-year-old can possess, that she is going to be a marine biologist, an astronaut, and a baker, all at the same time, and no one in our house has had the heart to tell her she might need to choose. I remarried 2 years ago to a man named Dominic, a pediatric physical therapist I met, fittingly, at one of the twins' early developmental checkups. He had been the one to walk me through Silas's early motor skill delays with a patience that startled me at the time, kneeling on the clinic floor beside my son, celebrating every small victory as though it were the most important achievement in the world. It took me nearly 8 months after we met to let myself trust his consistency, because a part of me kept waiting for the version of him that would eventually stop showing up. That version never arrived. Dominic is patient in a way I didn't know was possible until I watched him kneel on our living room floor for an hour, helping Silas build an elaborate dinosaur habitat out of couch cushions, without once checking his phone or glancing at a clock. He learned June's favorite bedtime songs before we were even engaged, and he still sings them off-key every single night, because she insists his version is better than mine, which I have decided not to take personally. He has never once made me feel like a burden, never once made our children feel like an obligation rather than a joy. He shows up, every single day, in every way that matters, he shows up. And I have come to understand that showing up, consistently and without fanfare, is the truest measure of love there is, far more than grand gestures or whispered promises ever were. Our wedding was small, held in my mother's backyard under string lights. Charlotte spent an entire weekend hanging. Silas served as our ring bearer, more interested in the flowers lining the aisle than the actual ceremony, and June insisted on wearing rain boots under her flower girl dress because, in her words, princesses need to be ready for anything. Watching Dominic promise, in front of everyone we loved, to show up for this family every day for the rest of his life, I felt something in my chest finally settle into place, something that had been unsteady since the night I lay alone on that operating table 4 years earlier. I think back sometimes to that night in the operating room, to the particular terror of screaming for a husband who would not come, and I no longer feel the crushing devastation that once defined that memory. What I feel instead is a strange, hard-won gratitude, because that night, as horrific as it was the beginning of the truth. The 5 words he left on that counter were meant, I believe, as a kind of justification, a way of framing his abandonment as an act of brave self-discovery. I think about those words differently now. Austin did choose himself that night, and every night after, right up until the life he chased with Vesper crumbled in his hands. The career he'd neglected slipped away, and the children he dismissed grew up knowing exactly which parent had stayed. I chose myself too, eventually, not in a hotel room 40 minutes from the people who needed me most, but in the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding, one difficult day at a time, a home filled with the kind of love that shows up even when it isn't easy. If you've ever found yourself on a kitchen floor staring at words that shattered everything you understood about your life, I want you to know that floor is not the end of your story. It only feels that way in the moment. So let me ask you this before you go. If you found a 5-word note like mine on your counter, would you have stayed and waited for an explanation, or would you have walked away and never looked back? If this story moved you, subscribe to Valira Payback, because we post a brand new story just like this one every single day.